The rifle shot that opened the morning was not the one that mattered. It came from the eastern berm at 0452, a qualification round, fired by a candidate who had arrived early and was burning off nerves the only way he knew how. The sound rolled across the Fort Bragg training complex and dissolved into the Carolina pines, and nobody paid it particular attention. On a sniper qualification range, the sound of a rifle is the sound of furniture. Background. Expected. The shot that would matter came later. 43 candidates would stand on that range before the day was finished, and most of them would fire weapons in anger and in fear, and in the controlled desperation of people who understood that 2% of the people who attempted this course would pass it, and today was the day the sorting began. But there is a question they do not teach at any military school in this country, and it sits underneath every qualification, evolution like a current under still water. The question is, how do you know who in the room is actually dangerous? Not trained, not skilled, not even committed. Dangerous. The answer, when it finally came, would weigh 14 rounds. At 0430 hours, Sergeant Owen Briggs was standing outside the administration building with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a clipboard that hadn't. He was a methodical man by nature, and by 19 years of professional practice, and methodical men notice things. What he noticed first on the morning that would later require him to write 43 pages of documented observation for a review board he did not know existed was the car. A Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a rear bumper held to the frame by a wire that had been twisted tight and left to rust. It pulled into the far end of the candidate parking area, away from the lifted trucks and the vehicles with unit stickers, and stopped. The engine ticked as it cooled. The woman who climbed out was 5'2" and would have weighed somewhere near 100 pounds soaking wet, which she was not yet, though the morning would attend to that. Her uniform was woodland camouflage, faded at least 2 sizes too large for her frame. Her boots had separated soles that someone had addressed with duct tape. Her range bag was so old it might have seen service in a conflict that these candidates had only read about. She stood beside the Civic for a moment with her hand on the door, not looking at the other candidates or the buildings or the range equipment being staged along the far fence. She was looking at the tree line. Briggs, who had watched a great many people arrive at this place over 19 years, watched her look at the tree pine and felt something move in the back of his mind. The way she scanned it, not curiosity, assessment. She walked toward the administration building with a gait that made almost no sound on the gravel, a heel-to-toe roll that kept her footfalls quiet. Not the walk of a woman trying to be quiet. The walk of a woman for whom quiet had become the default setting over a long time and through a process he could not yet name. He wrote the time in his notebook. He wrote Candidate Voss. Note gate. Her name was Sloan Voss, according to the enrollment roster. She had arrived at 0431, which was 59 minutes before the official formation time, which meant she had either been unable to sleep or had not tried. Her file, which Briggs had read as he read all candidate files, said she was from Ohio. Community college for 2 years. Employed at a sporting goods store for the 3 years following. No military record beyond the standard enlistment pathway that had brought her here. He looked at her walking away across the gravel and then looked down at his notebook. He wrote, "Does not fit file." The mess hall at 0500 hours was loud, the way military mess halls are always loud. The particular compression of many people in an enclosed space, all of them with somewhere to be, and most of them unwilling to be quiet about it. Briggs took his usual position near the side door, the one that gave him sight lines to both the main entrance and the serving line, and he ate without tasting anything and watched. Sloan Voss sat at the furthest table from the entrance in the corner where the wall met the wall, her back to nothing. She had chosen coffee and eggs, and she ate with mechanical efficiency, fueling rather than enjoying her eyes, tracking every person who came through the door with the automatic quality of a reflex that had been installed too deep to reach consciously. Garrett Thorne came through the main entrance at 0510 with the 4 men who went everywhere he went. Thorne was 6'4" and had the physical architecture of someone who had spent a decade building his body into a weapon, which he had. His head was shaved close. He moved with the performed authority of a man who had learned early that taking up space was a form of dominance, and who had never had cause to examine whether what he was dominating was worth dominating. Behind him, Tate Gifford, with the permanent sneer of a man perpetually amused by things that were not funny. Brett Kessler, who had the flat, watchful eyes of someone raised to follow, and had followed without question for long enough that following had become identity. Damon Mercer, cracking his knuckles with the rhythmic compulsion of a bad habit worn into the body. And Preston Ware, quieter than the others, bringing up the rear, the way a man brings up the rear when he has not decided yet whether he belongs in the group he is walking with. They took the center table. Their voices filled the room with the stories men tell when they need the room to know who they are. Confirmed kills, impossible distances, actions in theaters that could only be named obliquely. Briggs had heard variations of these stories for 19 years. Some of them were true. The ones that were true were usually told more quietly. Nora Callahan, the only other female candidate who had shown any promise in the preliminary screening, moved towards Sloane's table with her tray. She was halfway there when Thorne's voice cut across the mess hall. "Don't even think about it." Flat, final, a door closing. "Losers sit alone." Callahan hesitated. She looked at Sloane. Sloane did not look back. Callahan took her tray to another table and sat down and did not look at either of them again. And the expression she wore while she ate was the expression of a woman doing a calculation she did not like the result of. Thorne crossed the mess hall to Sloane's table. He stood over it with his shadow falling across her food. The performance was practice, the looming, the silence before speaking, the calibrated weight of a large man making a small person aware of the size differential. "You lost, sweetheart," he said. "Maul's that way." Sloane looked up. She met his eyes for 2 seconds and then returned to her food. The 2 seconds were what mattered. Briggs, watching from the side door, saw Thorne register something in those 2 seconds that he did not have a name for but that reached him anyway. Not defiance, not fear. The flat, evaluative quality of someone who has looked at a great many threats and is looking at this one and finding it does not require a change of plan. Thorne slammed his palm on the table. The juice cup jumped. Sloane reached out and steadied it, took another bite of eggs. The mess hall erupted when he upended the tray. Laughter, applause, the sound of a room that has been given permission to be cruel and has taken the offer. Scrambled eggs and coffee across the front of Sloane's uniform. She sat perfectly still for 3 seconds. Then she stood, picked up the tray, and walked to the cleanup station. No hurry, no anger. Mechanical efficiency, the way you move through a task that is unpleasant but does not rise to the level of meaningful. As she passed the center table, her eyes made a brief circuit of the room. Briggs had positioned himself to see this. He watched her eyes move, and he recognized what the motion was. She was reading firing angles. From her previous seat to the windows. From the windows to the exits. The same involuntary calculation she had made when she walked in, now updated for a changed position. Muscle memory. He wrote it down. The qualification range at 0600 was a different kind of noise. Organized, purposeful. The sound of 43 people preparing to be judged. Captain Frank Hollis walked the line with his clipboard and the expression of a man who has made his decisions about this group before anyone has fired a shot. Hollis was 51 years old and had been at this installation for 7 years. He had a chest full of legitimate decorations in a manner that had calcified at some point in his late 30s into something that was professionally competent and personally contemptuous. The manner of a man who has spent a long time deciding that the institution he serves is better than the people it produces. The weapons assignment followed a logic that was not the logic of a fair test. The top candidates, Thorne's group, the candidates, Hollis had already written favorable preliminary notes on received new Remington 700s with Night Force scopes that had been bore-sighted that morning by the Armory. The ammunition they received was matched by lot number, which is to say it was consistent, which is to say it behaved predictably, which is the foundational requirement of any accurate shooting. Sloane received a Barrett M82 with a serial number that designated it as equipment that should have been retired. The barrel showed wear that a qualified armorer would have flagged. The scope would have required significant adjustment to bring on zero. Her ammunition came from 3 different lot numbers, which meant 3 different powder loads, which meant 3 different points of impact at distance, which meant that maintaining consistent accuracy across a qualification string was close to impossible. Master Sergeant Luther Crane, who ran the armory and who had been running armories for 31 years, watched the assignment from the doorway of the equipment shed. He had not been asked to make these assignments. Someone had left the allocation sheet on his desk that morning, and he had processed it without comment because processing things without comment was how you survived 31 years in places that did not show up in your service record. But he watched, and he noted. Station 13, Hollis announced, far right. Station 13 was the worst position on the range for the morning qualification window. The sun would be in the shooter's face by mid-morning. A gap in the berm structure amplified the crosswind. A concrete barrier to the immediate right would trap brass and powder residue, creating a chemical haze with every shot fired. Sloane carried her equipment to the station without comment. She set the rifle down and began sorting her ammunition. Kessler noticed first, though, he did not understand what he was seeing. He nudged Gifford and pointed. She was separating the rounds by hand, rolling each one between her thumb and forefinger, then sorting them into specific groups. No scale, no measurement equipment, just her hands. What's she doing? Gifford said. Thorne glanced over and looked away, wasting time. What she was doing was measuring. The weight differential between ammunition from different powder lots is measurable by hand if your hands have been trained for long enough in the specific art of detecting it. She was sorting by weight, identifying which rounds were heaviest and which lightest, and arranging them in a sequence that would allow her to compensate for the varying ballistic performance of each group. It was meticulous. It was the work of someone who had done this before in conditions where the difference between a light powder load and a standard one was not a qualification score, but something she could not afford to lose. The warm-up evolution was set at 100 yards. Standard target man-size silhouette, 10 rounds in 10 minutes. Thorne went first. He made a ceremony of it, the theatrical scope adjustment, the audible controlled breathing, the body language of a man performing competence for an audience. 10 shots, 10 bullseyes. He stood and raised his arms, and Gifford and Kessler responded exactly as they had been cued to respond, and Hollis made an approving notation, and the morning felt for a moment like it was going the way Hollis had written it. Sloan took her position. She spent 3 minutes on her scope adjustment, which was 3 minutes of quiet commentary from the adjacent stations, and then she fired 10 rounds. 7 hits, 3 misses. The 3 misses were not near misses. They were significantly off-target keyhole patterns in the dirt, berm below and left of the silhouette. The laughter was immediate and sustained. Hollis shook his head and wrote something that made Thorne reading over his shoulder grin. The range went to ceasefire for target inspection. Briggs walked down range with the score sheet as was procedure. He reached Sloan's target. He looked at it. He looked at it for a moment longer than the score sheet required. Then he walked the extra distance to where her 3 missed rounds had struck and crouched down and examined the entry marks in the dirt. Keyholing. The bullets had tumbled in flight. Not bad shooting, bad ammunition rounds so inconsistent in their powder load that the projectile was destabilized before it reached the target. He walked back to Sloan's target. 7 rounds, 1 hole. The rounds had grouped so tightly that without magnification it appeared to be a single impact point slightly left of center, but consistent, the kind of grouping that represented a controlled, repeatable process. She had identified which rounds were defective and put them at the end of the string. She had shot the good ammunition through 1 hole and the bad ammunition into the dirt, and the score sheet said 7 out of 10, which was a failing result, and nobody except Owen Briggs understood what the target was actually showing. He wrote in his notebook, 7 rounds, 1 hole, separated defective lots by feel, does not fit file. He did not say anything to anyone. He returned to the scoring table. He watched Thorne accept congratulations. He watched Hollis record Sloan's score with the expression of a man confirming what he already knew. Briggs wrote, "Who is she?" Twist 1 established itself quietly in the dirt behind the berm, in a grouping that nobody who mattered took the time to see. By 0800, the wind had picked up to 20 knots with gusts that shifted direction without warning, and the 500-yard evolution was where real separation happened. At 500 yards in variable wind, the gap between someone who has trained and someone who is something else entirely becomes a gap you can measure in inches on the target face. Thorne's squad managed respectable scores. Thorne himself hit 7 out of 10, which was solid work in those conditions, and he knew it, and the way he held his shoulders said he knew it. Sloan was set up at Station 13 when Hollis walked the line from behind his clipboard, making the same motion it had been making all morning, and his boot connected with the barrel of her rifle. Not an accident. The angle was deliberate. The force was calibrated to send the muzzle down far enough to ruin the shot without breaking the weapon. Hollis kept walking. "Secure your equipment, Voss." She lifted her head from the stock, looked at where the round had gone. Then she began the process of re-zeroing the scope, which cost her 5 minutes and 2 rounds of her ammunition allocation, and which the clock on the qualification evolution did not pause for. 8 minutes remaining, 9 shots to fire. She fired all 9, 8 center mass. The 9th caught the target at the left shoulder. Hollis recorded 7 hits. Briggs, who had been watching through his spotting scope from the scoring table, wrote the actual count in his notebook and put a line under it. He did not confront the discrepancy. He was not yet certain enough of what he was watching to confront anything, but he was becoming more certain by the hour, and certainty in Owen Briggs produced documentation, which was its own kind of weapon. At 0930, during the break between evolutions, Briggs filed the background check request. He used the standard channel in the standard form, in the standard language, and he sent it to the standard recipient and expected the standard response time of 48 to 72 hours. He was slightly surprised to receive a response in 11 minutes. He was significantly surprised by what the response said. Sloan Voss, born Columbus, Ohio. Community college, no degree. Employment at a sporting goods retailer for 37 months. Financial records consistent with the stated employment. social media presence consistent with stated interests, medical records on file. Everything was there. Everything was correct. Everything was exactly what it was supposed to be, down to the level of detail that only a careful institutional record contained. Briggs had been in the Army for 19 years. He had processed a great many personnel files. He knew the texture of a file that had grown organically accumulated over years of real life versus the texture of a file that had been constructed. The difference was difficult to articulate, but not difficult to feel, in the same way that a reproduction of an antique feels different from the antique itself when you run your hand across it, even when the reproduction is very good. This file was very good, but it had been built. He wrote legend, well constructed, significant resources required, who built it and why. He put the notebook in his breast pocket and walked back to his position at the scoring table. Captain Hollis at the far end of the range was reviewing something on his phone. His expression, which Briggs could not read from this distance, did not match the expression of a man reviewing something routine. Twist 2 settled into place, the file that was too clean, the record that was too complete, the background of a woman who did not exist in the way the paperwork said she existed. The Advanced Ballistics Module convened at 1400 hours in the low concrete building at the back of the range complex. Hollis walked them through the theoretical framework: long-range terminal ballistics in variable conditions, the mathematics of external ballistics at extended distances, the effects of environmental variables on projectile flight. 43 candidates arranged in metal folding chairs. Most had calculators and reference cards. Sloan had a pen. The problem set was designed to require 40 minutes. It accounted for wind drift elevation, correction, humidity-induced air density variation, barometric pressure, and the Coriolis effect on a 900-meter shot with a moving target component. It was genuinely complex work. Thorne, who was a competent shooter and an intelligent man, when he chose to apply that intelligence to something other than social dominance, worked it methodically with his references spread across his writing surface and completed it in 35 minutes. Sloan wrote steadily for 11 minutes without pausing to check any reference. Her equations filled the page in compact, precise notation. She applied corrections in sequence with the confidence of someone who has done this calculation enough times that the process has moved from cognition to reflex. She reached the final line, circled her answer, and set her pen down. Briggs, walking the room on the pretense of distributing a supplemental handout, glanced at her worksheet as he passed. He kept walking. He did not change his pace. But when he reached the supplier table at the front of the room, he stood with his back to the class for a moment longer than the errand required. The correction factor on the final line of her calculation accounted for aerodynamic jump induced by the crosswind component, incorporating gyroscopic stability, modeling, and the Magnus effect on spin drift across the terminal portion of the projectile's flight path. It was a legitimate correction. Applied correctly, it produced measurably more accurate results at ranges above 800 meters in the specific wind condition the problem described. The correction had been developed and validated by the Special Operations Command Advanced Marksmanship Unit. The methodology had been finalized approximately 3 years ago. It had not been published in any open-source document. It did not appear in any manual available to civilian shooters or standard military personnel. Its distribution was restricted to a specific tier of qualified operators. There was no sporting goods store in Ohio where she could have learned it. There was no book she could have read. There was no course she could have attended. Briggs returned to his position and wrote one line in his notebook. He drew a box around it, and he underlined the box. Hollis collected the worksheets at the end of the module. When he reached Sloan's, he looked at it for a long moment. The expression that crossed his face was not the expression of an instructor reviewing an unexpected performance. It was the expression of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he had been carrying and does not welcome the confirmation. He tucked the worksheet under the others on his clipboard. His hand tightened on the board slightly and then relaxed, and then he moved on. In the back of the room, Sloan watched him move on. The vehicle course was a quarter-mile of cracked asphalt behind the Eastern Range Complex, a serpentine track with hard corners and 2 marked stop points. The exercise required candidates to drive it at speed, demonstrate control under simulated contact conditions, and execute a rapid dismount. Standard pre-drive inspection took most candidates between 2 and 4 minutes. They checked the visible items, the obvious items, the items that an inspection is designed to find. Sloan's inspection took 9 minutes and covered every accessible component. When her hands reached the brake lines, they stopped, both hands resting against the lines completely still. The duration was approximately 2 seconds. Then she continued to the next component, completed the inspection, and got in the vehicle. Briggs at the scoring table wrote, "She found it. Adapted. Watch." She drove the course without at once touching the primary brake pedal. Engine braking through the hard corners, the emergency brake applied with measured precision at the marked stops the vehicle brought to rest within acceptable margins by technique, rather than the equipment that someone had made unreliable. The driving looked awkward to an observer who was watching the vehicle without knowing why the technique had been modified. It looked like inexperience. Thorne, who had finished his run and was standing near the scoring table, frowned at the monitor. She afraid of the brakes? Briggs said nothing. She dismounted at the final cone in a single fluid motion and walked to the scoring table and set her keys on the surface and waited. Hollis recorded the time and moved on. It was Luther Crane who stopped everything, though he was not on the vehicle course and was not supposed to be part of this evolution at all. He was walking back from the motor pool along the service road that ran parallel to the course, and he saw Sloan step out of the vehicle, and he stopped walking. Crane had spent 31 years in the service. His actual service record showed approximately half of what his actual service had been because the other half had occurred in places and capacities that do not appear in service records that can be requested under the Freedom of Information Act. He had worked alongside people who did not exist in personnel systems. He had learned to read the way certain people move through space because that reading had kept him alive on 2 continents and in circumstances that oversight committees had voted specifically not to know about. The way Sloan Voss stepped out of that vehicle, the posture as she stood, shoulders settling back to a precise angle that was not a natural resting position, but a trained one, the position of someone who has spent extended time on elevated platforms in hostile environments and has built that awareness so deeply into the body that it persists even in a parking lot in North Carolina on a training day. The hands. The way her trigger finger indexed automatically along the doorframe as she pushed it closed. Not deliberately, not consciously. The automatic expression of 10,000 repetitions. He had seen those hands before, not these exact hands, but this exact movement, in a photograph that had sat on a table at a memorial ceremony, in a place that was not on any official scale with people who were not officially there, folding a flag for a man who was not officially the next of kin. Crane turned around and walked back toward the motor pool before anyone saw his face. He sat on a toolbox and looked at the floor for a long time. The memorial had been in November of 2019. He had stood in a row with men he knew only by call signs, and they had watched the flag being folded and handed to a tall man in civilian clothes whose face showed the controlled grief of someone who has learned that grief, like everything else, must be managed. There had been a photograph on a table. A woman in full kit, face partially obscured by shadows and paint, 5 feet 2 inches, the way she stood in that photograph. He sat on the toolbox. Twist 3. Luther Crane, who had attended her funeral, recognized the ghost. At 16:45, Preston Ware found her in the corner of the equipment bay. She was behind a rack of communications gear, performing the detailed inspection of her rifle that she performed every evening. The bolt was out. She was working a cleaning patch through the barrel with the focus of a person doing something that mattered in the way that a specific and important skill matters to the person who possesses it. Ware stopped at the edge of the rack. He verified they were not observed. He stepped forward. "I don't have much time," he said. She did not stop working. "Then say it quickly." "Checkpoint 3 tonight. There's an old bunker in the training area." He stopped. Something worked in his jaw. The door locks from the outside. "I know." He stood there for a moment listening to the cleaning rod work through the barrel. "Then why are you going?" She looked up. The look that she gave him was not unkind, but it was without softness in the way that certain kinds of honesty are without softness. Not because the person does not feel anything, but because they have learned that softness is a form of imprecision and imprecision costs. "Because sometimes you have to enter the trap to spring it," she said. "But thank you, Ware. What you're doing right now took more than most people have." He was about to turn away when she spoke again. "Your brother would be proud of you." He went still. "How do you know about my brother?" "The same way I know you've been resisting Thorne's influence all week," she said. "The same way I know you keep his picture in your left chest pocket. Some things can't be hidden from someone trained to observe." She held something out to him without looking up from the barrel. A backup flashlight, small and matte black. "Stay with the main group tonight. All of them. When it's over, you'll want to be somewhere with a camera. So will Callahan." He took the flashlight. He walked back to the main bay without asking any further questions, and if his hands were not entirely steady, the distance was sufficient that no one saw it. At 1700 hours, Hollis announced the night navigation exercise. 43 candidates, 43 separate routes, same series of checkpoints by different paths. Sloan's assigned route went through Training Area 7, abandoned since the 1960s, full of defunct structures, including an old emergency shelter at grid coordinate 372, whose door locked from the outside. At 1600 hours before the final equipment, staging for the night exercise, Hollis gathered the candidates for a briefing on the navigation protocols. He stood at the front of the staging area with his clipboard and his expression of professional authority, and he walked through the checkpoints, the timing requirements, the scoring methodology. While he spoke, three of his range assistants moved through the staging area on various pretexts: equipment checks, inventory verification, the small administrative tasks that are always available as cover for proximity to someone else's gear. Sloane's equipment bag was unattended for a total of approximately 4 minutes across 3 separate periods. When she retrieved it for the final check, she went through every item with the systematic patience of someone who has learned that unattended equipment in a hostile environment is a problem waiting to present itself. Night vision batteries dead. Mount screws on her scope loosened. In her two-do, which she had not opened since morning pages from a sniper manual with margin annotations in handwriting that was not hers. She replaced the batteries from her personal reserve. She retightened the mount screws with the small tool she kept in her inner jacket pocket. She removed the planted pages and put them in the waste collection at the edge of the staging area without reading them. She did all of this without changing the expression she had maintained all day, which was the expression of a person engaged in routine preparation. Nora Callahan, staging 2 positions down, watched this happen with the focused attention of someone who has been paying close attention all day and has arrived at a significant question. What kind of person anticipates planted evidence well enough to carry a spare battery reserve and keep a scope tool in her inner pocket before anyone has done anything? She would think about this question during the navigation exercise through the sound of explosions and gunfire that was not part of any training scenario she had been briefed on, and she would arrive at an answer that she was not certain she believed, and then the answer would be confirmed, and believing it would become the only available option. She positioned herself near the parking area before 2000 hours as she had been told. She pointed her camera at the far end of the lot as she had been told. When Hollis appeared at a run from the direction of the headquarters building, and Preston Ware stepped out of the shadow of a parked vehicle and brought him down with the clean, committed technique of someone who has just decided to do something and is committed to doing it correctly. She recorded every second. Thorne volunteered to set up checkpoint stations. Hollis approved it with the expression of a man who is very pleased with himself. Nora Callahan, who had been watching all of this from the periphery of events all day with the particular attentiveness of someone trying to understand a situation that is larger than its visible surface, crossed the staging area during the final equipment check and stopped beside Sloane. "That route they assigned you," Callahan said low. "Grid 372, the old shelter." "I know," Sloane said. Callahan looked at her. "Then why aren't you saying something?" "Because sometimes the trap catches the hunter." Sloane met her eyes briefly. "Stay close to Ware tonight. You're going to want to record whatever happens in the parking lot after 2000 hours. Callahan opened her mouth, closed it, nodded once with the decisive economy of a woman who has processed an incomplete instruction and has decided to trust the source of it. She walked away. Sloane finished her equipment check. At 1800 hours, the exercise began. The afternoon advanced ballistics module ran from 1400 to 1600 hours in the low concrete building behind the range complex. 43 candidates, metal folding chairs, a presentation screen that had not been updated in 2 years based on the version numbers on the slides. Most candidates pulled out calculators and reference cards, laminated pages of compiled data, the kind of material you earned the right to carry after enough repetitions that the compilation itself was meaningful. Thorne had his spread across the writing surface of his chair with the confident arrangement of a man who has prepared correctly for a known test. Sloane had a pen. The problem set was designed to consume 40 minutes. Long-range terminal ballistics in variable conditions, wind drift elevation correction, humidity and barometric pressure affects the Coriolis component on a 900-meter shot with a lateral target movement element. It was genuine complexity, not a test of memorization, but of understanding the ability to apply principles to a specific problem rather than retrieve a stored answer. Thorne worked methodically from his references and completed it in 33 minutes. He double-checked 2 of the figures and was satisfied and set his pen down. Sloane finished in 11 minutes. Briggs was walking the room distributing a supplemental handout that could have been distributed at any time and was distributed now because Briggs had reached the point where he needed to see her worksheet. He passed her row. He glanced down with the practiced peripheral vision of a man who has spent 19 years looking at things without appearing to look at them. He kept walking without any change in his pace or expression. At the supply table, he stood for a moment longer than the errand required. The final correction factor on her worksheet incorporated aerodynamic jump from the crosswind component, applying gyroscopic stability modeling, and the Magnus effect on spin drift across the terminal portion of the flight path. Legitimate, accurate. The kind of correction that applied precisely produced measurably better results at ranges beyond 800 meters in the specific wind condition the problem described. The Special Operations Command Advanced Marksmanship Unit had finalized and validated this methodology approximately 3 years ago. It had not been published. It had not been distributed beyond a specific clearance tier. There was no version of Sloan Voss's stated background that could have put that formula in her hands. He returned to his position. Hollis collected the worksheets. When he reached Sloan's, he stopped walking and looked at it for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a teaching assessment required. His expression did not change in any way that someone watching casually would notice. The hand holding the clipboard tightened slightly. Then he moved on. Hollis was not stupid. Whatever else he was not stupid. And the formula on Sloan's worksheet told him something he did not want confirmed. He had been watching her all day, recording her failures and suppressing her actual performance, moving with the confidence of a man whose plan is proceeding as designed. The worksheet revised his confidence. Briggs, watching from across the room, saw it happen in the set of Hollis's jaw and the way he turned the clipboard slightly so that nobody beside him could read its surface. He wrote in his notebook, "Hollis is afraid of her." He underlined it. 43 candidates spread into the tree line in ones and twos, dispersing across the training area with map and compass equipment and the night vision gear that in Sloan's case ran on batteries someone had replaced with dead ones sometime during the final staging hour. Sloan walked into the tree line and stopped. She stood at the edge of the administration building's light for 30 seconds, letting her eyes adapt. She had long ago learned that reaching for artificial light when the dark made you uncomfortable was a form of impatience the dark consistently punished. She waited. The tree line resolved from black to texture, shapes separating from depth, the difference between a trunk and a shadow making itself available. She moved through the trees without a flashlight, without night vision equipment, paralleling her assigned route 20 meters inside the tree line rather than following it. Her boots found ground she could not fully see with the confidence of someone who has moved through darkness in conditions where the cost of noise was not a qualification score, but something worse. 50 meters from checkpoint 3, she went to ground. The white oak she chose had been growing for 60 years, its first branches beginning 8 feet up. She went up, it one-handed, her rifle slung across her back, her boots reading the bark for purchase with the practiced confidence of someone who has climbed worse, in worse conditions, with less light and more at stake. From the third branch, she had a clear sight line to the clearing below, through the small monocular she had kept in her inner jacket pocket, separate from all equipment that had been accessible to anyone else during the day. 4 men. Thorne Gifford Kessler and a fourth she recognized after a moment as one of Hollis's range assistants, a man she had cataloged as a background figure and was now revising upward as an active participant. This revised her estimate of Hollis's organizational reach within the support staff. Useful information. She stored it. Preston Ware was not in the clearing. Good, he had listened. She watched the 4 of them for 4 minutes. She read their positions, the arcs of their movement, the mechanism of the bunker door, the locking bar arrangement, and its gauged the sight lines from each position to the approach path. She noted the distance to Building 31, which was the nearest elevated structure with adequate sight lines for what she was already planning. She noted the wind direction at ground level, which had increased since the briefing to something near 25 knots, gusting from the southwest, with a rain system pushing in from the coast. She could go around them. She had the terrain and the time and the training. She could complete the alternate route, arrive at the final checkpoint with her card stamped, and this piece of Hollis's plan would fail without her participation. Tomorrow he would recalibrate, and the operation would continue on a timeline she might not be able to read in advance. The operation he had authorized for tonight, fragmented intelligence, 2 separate sources, cross-referenced over 6 weeks, was keyed to a specific window. If she went around this clearing, Hollis would know the trap had failed. He would postpone, and the network would have more time to move assets, warn nodes, change its geometry. She climbed down from the oak. She moved to the trail. She made enough noise crossing a dry stretch of ground that 4 men in a clearing 50 meters away could hear her coming. They emerged from the shadows like something rehearsed, which it was. Thorne in front, Gifford and Kessler on the flanks, the range assistant near the bunker door. The expression Thorne wore was the expression of arrival at a moment anticipated. Checkpoint 3, Sloan said. Voss for navigation card. Nobody produced a navigation card. End of the line. Thorne stepped forward. She looked at the bunker door pulled wide on screaming hinges by Gifford. She read the locking mechanism, a drop bar arrangement, heavy steel designed for North Carolina weather across multiple decades. She measured the gauge with her eyes. She noted the warping in the frame that would affect the pin tolerances of the lock from the inside. She noted the hinge quality and the weight distribution on the door. She had approximately 3 seconds to gather this information, and she gathered it. She looked back at Thorne. 6 hours, she said. Stay together, all of you. What's that mean? Advice, flat, final. They moved her toward the entrance. She caught Thorne's wrist for one moment as she passed him long enough. Tick-tock, she said. Twist 4, she had chosen the trap. Not because she had no other option, but because it was the right move in an operation larger than anyone in that clearing understood. She stepped into the darkness. The door swung shut. The drop bar came down with the sound of a bolt going home, and outside, she heard Thorne making a comment that generated laughter from Gifford, and then the sound of them moving away across the clearing, toward the trail, toward their alibi, toward the story they would tell in the morning about a candidate who had simply not shown up. Absolute darkness, 60 years of concrete and damp, and the slow decay of enclosed time. She stood completely still for 60 seconds. She allowed herself this. She had set this boundary years ago, and she kept it with the same discipline. She kept all her operational parameters, because the alternative was to let the 60 seconds become 90, become 3 minutes, become the length of time it would take to work through all of it, which was longer than any operation could wait. She counted 7 names: Daniel Ho, Marcus Webb, James Ferris, Andrew Cole, Robert Stanwyck, Michael Tate, Francisco Vela. She did not think about the convoy or the fire or the specific acoustic signature an ambush makes when it opens up on a line of vehicles at contact range. She thought about what she knew of each man from files memorized in the way you memorize the faces of people you are responsible for, even when the official record says you were never there. Daniel Howe had a daughter named Claire, who would be 11 years old now, learning to read music in a house where the father who had died, so that an intelligence operation could maintain its cover, would never sit at the table. Marcus Webb had been 14 days from rotation home. James Ferris had been learning guitar. Andrew Cole and Robert Stanwyck had grown up 12 miles apart in central Georgia and had discovered this fact in country in the specific way that people discover commonality when they are far from everything common. Michael Tate had written his mother every week. Francisco Vela had been 23 years old. 7 names, 7 men who had gone into positions that someone had sold to people who wanted them dead. 7 men who were the reason she was standing in a bunker in the dark counting. This was the cost. Not the scar on her wrist, or the years of names that were not her name, or the marriage that existed primarily in encrypted files and brief meetings in rooms where introductions were not real. The cost was 7 names she would carry until this was finished and she was not finished. She went to work. The wire came from her inner jacket pocket. She worked it into the mechanism at the angle she had calculated from her external observation. Old lock widened tolerances from decades of weathering, 3-pin sequential. The first moved in 40 seconds. The second in 90. The third required a modified approach because the warped door frame had shifted the geometry from its design specification, and she adjusted working by feel rather than calculation in the absolute dark, and the third pin moved. The bar lifted. She pushed the door open and stepped into the moonlight. The first explosion reached her before she had taken 3 steps. She knew it the way she knew a great many things below the level of conscious reasoning, from a place where experience had burned its lessons so deeply they no longer required processing. Training charges were designed to simulate. This sound had the low concussive register of ordnance built to actually destroy. It traveled through the ground as much as through the air, the way serious things travel. The second explosion came 8 seconds later, closer. Then the automatic weapons fire. A K pattern rifles the cyclic rate and acoustic signature unmistakable to anyone who has heard enough of them in actual operational context. Not from the range complex, from the base perimeter. Sector 7. The base sirens, 3 rising tones repeating. FPCON Delta. Hostile forces on the installation. The announcement from the external speakers 30 seconds later, and the words "not a drill" moving across the training area with a specific weight of words that are very rarely true. She was already running. Behind her, she heard Thorne's radio crackle to life, and heard him call out to the others, and heard in the stripping of his voice down to its actual register, the sound of a man who has made a significant error and understands exactly what that means in this moment. She gave him the bearing in the distance to the arms room without breaking stride and without looking back, and then she accelerated, and the dark took her completely. The arms room was 400 meters from the training area access road. She covered it in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which was faster than the terrain In the darkness and the wind should have permitted, but she was not moving at the speed the terrain recommended. She was moving at the speed the situation required. Code 77 Alpha. The duty sergeant looked up from his desk when she came through the door. He started to say something about authorization. She said the code. He looked at her. He looked at his computer screen, where something had just populated that had not been on his screen 30 seconds ago. A standing authorization preloaded, awaiting this exact credential from this exact moment. He looked at her again. He opened the arms room without another word. She went past the new equipment, past the Remington 700s and the M100s and the current issue optics, to a specific case in the controlled storage section, the one with the tag that listed a decommission date in 2019 and a disposal record that had never been executed because someone had ensured it would not be executed. Macmillan T, AK338, serial number PS007. Her hands knew the weapon before her eyes had fully registered it. She ran the function check in the dark without looking, her fingers finding each component in the sequence she had used 10,000 times, confirming each action by feel and sound. The weapon was in the condition she had kept it in. Someone on this installation had been maintaining it, which meant someone had known, which meant the operation had reach she had not fully mapped. She loaded specific ammunition from the controlled storage, the lot number she had identified 6 weeks ago when she first accessed the system and confirmed the round was still in inventory. She verified the scope 0 against the reference card she had carried in her inner pocket since arriving at Fort Bragg. She slung the rifle and was out the door in under 3 minutes. Outside in the parking area, she heard Thorne and his squad arriving from the access road. She heard Thorne's voice asking questions that she did not have time to answer. She gave him the instructions: guard the armory, confirm friendly forces, only do not move, and was gone before he finished processing them. Building 31 was the administrative center for the Eastern Range Complex, a 2-story concrete structure with a flat roof and maintenance access via a ladder mounted to the northeast wall. The roof was graveled, adequate for a shooting position, with clear sight lines to the Sector 7 tree line, where muzzle flashes marked hostile positions at irregular intervals. She went up the maintenance ladder, one-handed rifle slung, and gained the roof in 40 seconds. 750 yards to the nearest muzzle flash. Wind at 25 knots from the southwest, gusting irregular rain, beginning in light drops that would increase. Ambient light, half-moon, intermittent cloud cover. She built her position in 22 seconds. No sandbags, no bipod. Her body positioned with the specificity of someone who has learned to be her own stable platform, the bones aligned to accept recoil through the structure of the skeleton rather than the muscles, the natural point of aim established by moving the body rather than forcing the weapon. She found the enemy sniper first. He was good. She could see from his shot pattern that he was good. The consistency of interval, the discipline of position changed the way he was keeping 2 of the base security response teams pinned down without exposing himself to the return fire that those teams were trying to produce. There were wounded men in the open below his position that no one could reach because of his fire, and they had been there for what her clock said was 11 minutes. She acquired him in 7 seconds. The position he had chosen was excellent. She could not see him. She could see where he had to be, which was a different kind of seeing. She had been doing it long enough that the difference between visible and inferable had reduced to something near nothing. 7 seconds acquisition, 7 seconds hold, 3 seconds reset. The rifle fired between heartbeats. 823 yards. The hostile sniper's position went silent. Not a pause in his fire cycle. A cessation. The body language of a position suddenly absent its operator. She was already moving, displacing to the northwest corner of the roof before the sound of her own shot had finished traveling. Rule 1 of the work she did: you never fire twice from the same location. The round downrange was an announcement of your presence. The only question was whether your next position could be established before that announcement was fully processed. The machine gun team was the second problem. They had the main gate under sustained suppressive fire, keeping reinforcements from reaching the interior of the base, and the gunner was confident in the angle of his cover, confident enough to have settled into a rhythm that she could read from the roof of Building 31. She found her natural point of aim on the new position. 791 yards. The gunner was partially exposed at the shoulder in his rhythmic movement. She accounted for the temperature differential over the parking lot asphalt between her and the target, the heat rising in a thin layer that bent light in ways the scope would not automatically correct. The gunner was mid-burst when she fired. He dropped with the specific completeness of a person who no longer had any engagement with the outcome of the situation they had been participating in. His assistant looked around with the panicked, searching expression of someone who has understood that something has gone wrong, but cannot locate the source of the wrongness. She fired again before the assistant could take over the weapon. In the Tactical Operations Center, Colonel Parrish stood over the display and watched the threat indicators change in ways he could not account for with any resource he had deployed. "What is that?" his aide said. The security camera for Building 31's roof showed a figure in the poor resolution and the rain, but the movement was legible, even at this quality, even through this weather. Small, moving between positions with an economy of motion that spoke of a very specific kind of training being expressed at a very high level of proficiency. Crane arrived at the door. He looked at the screen and his jaw set. 773, he said quietly. 7 seconds acquisition. 7 seconds hold. 3 seconds reset. He stopped. "There is only one person who ever used that shooting rhythm. I was present at her memorial service." "We never recovered the body," Parrish said. "No," Crane said, "we never did." On the screen, the figure fired again. The hostile radio net, which Parrish's communications section had been monitoring since the breach, had been producing coordinated communication through the first 6 minutes of the engagement unit, leaders directing fire coordinating movement, maintaining the operational structure of a well-planned action. What it produced now was different. Questions without answers, short transmissions that stopped mid-sentence, the specific audio texture of an operation that has encountered something it did not plan for and is trying to determine whether the plan can be salvaged. The answer, which the hostile network was arriving at approximately 1 transmission too late per casualty, was no. She worked the roof with the methodical patience of someone who has long since moved past the emotional content of what she is doing and arrived at the technical content, which is the only state in which this kind of work can be done accurately and for an extended period. Each shot was preceded by the same sequence: acquire, calculate, adjust, hold, fire. Each displacement was immediate before the echo of the shot had resolved. Each new position was chosen from the previous one, the geometry of the roof providing 8 viable options that she cycled through with the efficient routing of someone who has done this math before. The hostile commander was the 12th target. He was trying to rally the remaining 3 men directing a retrograde, calling for extraction on a frequency she had been monitoring through a captured earpiece since the 3rd minute of the engagement. 912 yards, the extreme edge of reliable range in these conditions, the rain now coming in earnest, the wind gusting unpredictably. She did not calculate this shot. There are shots that are calculated and shots that are felt, and the difference is not mystical, but practical at the far end of the performance envelope, in conditions where the variables exceed the precision of calculation. What remains is the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 previous shots expressed as intuition, as a feeling of rightness or wrongness, that has been calibrated by 10,000 rounds of feedback. She found the angle. She felt the wind. She made the adjustments that her body knew to make without being told. She fired. 912 yards away, the hostile commander's transmission ended. The remaining 3 broke and ran for the tree line. She tracked them with the clinical patience of someone completing a task, not the heat of someone pursuing a victory. 3 more shots. 3 more results. The Sector 7 threat display, which Parrish was watching from the operations center, went from 12 active indicators to nothing. 13 minutes and 47 seconds from the first shot. 14 rounds expended. She cleared the weapon and engaged the safety and let herself stay in position for 10 seconds without moving, which was not procedure. It was the 10 seconds she gave herself at the end of an engagement, the counterpart to the 60 seconds at the beginning, the bracket that contained the work and separated it from everything that came before and after. 10 seconds in which she was neither what she had been doing nor what she would be doing next. 7 names still. She slung the rifle and went down the maintenance ladder. In the Emergency Operations Center, Parrish stood with both hands flat on the table and looked at the empty threat display. "Get me General Theodore Ashford," he said. "Priority actual. Tell him Shadow 9 is alive." Crane said nothing. He was looking at the screen that showed the roof of Building 31 now empty, the rain falling on gravel that held no shape of anything. The quick reaction helicopters arrived 5 minutes later and flew over Sector 7 in expanding search patterns and found nothing that required their particular capabilities. 12 confirmed hostiles. No survivors, no evidence of any shooter that the helicopter crews could locate. Parrish looked at the arms room access log on his secondary screen. 1927 hours. PS-007, 14 rounds issued. He waited. At 1953 hours, the arms room log updated weapon returned. 14 rounds expended. Inventory confirmed. He picked up his phone. Outside the arms room, in the yellow light of the exterior lamp, Thorne and his squad stood in the specific posture of people who spent an hour processing an experience that does not fit the categories they had been using to understand the world. When she came out of the dark into the light, Thorne's hand came up toward a salute before he caught himself. The hand hung there halfway up with nowhere to go. She walked past him to the service window. She handled the weapon return with the same flat efficiency she had handled every other task of the day, completely correctly without drama. Then she turned to them. Thorne was in the center of whatever shape they had unconsciously formed. Something had changed in the architecture of his face, not defeat, but the expression of a man whose framework for understanding the situation has been revised so significantly that the revision has not yet finished settling. Thorne, he straightened. 0600 Colonel Parrish's office. Bring your squad, all of them. A pause. Including where? She walked into the rain. Behind her in the yellow light, nobody spoke for a long time. Then Kessler said not to anyone in particular in the quiet voice of a man who has just understood something that changes the shape of the day he thought he had been having. She knew the whole time she knew. Thorne looked at the dark where she had been. He looked at the roof of Building 31, visible above the tree line, its edges blurred by the rain. He looked at his hands. Yeah, he said. She knew. Twist 5 was already descending from the sky in a transport helicopter that carried no identifying markings 20 minutes out in a flight suit, with the expression of a man who has been running a very long operation and has just received a call that changed the timeline. The helicopter that landed at 2000 hours was a military transport with no identifying markings beyond its registration number, and the man who stepped out of it was wearing a flight suit with the rank insignia of a general officer and the expression of someone who has been running a very long operation and has just received a radio call that changed the timeline. General Theodore Ashford was 6'2" and had the physical presence of a man who had spent decades in positions that required other people to take him seriously without being told to. His hair had gone silver at the temples. The lines in his face were the lines of someone who had made decisions under time pressure, in conditions where the wrong decision had irreversible consequences, and who had made enough of those decisions that the weight of them had become part of his physiognomy. He had 3 men with him. They peeled off at the landing pad. He walked alone toward the headquarters building, and anyone watching him walk could have read from his pace and direction that he already knew where he was going and what he was going to find when he arrived. Colonel Douglas Parrish was waiting in the corridor outside his office. He had been waiting for 4 minutes, which was long enough to have thought carefully about how to open a conversation that he did not have adequate frameworks for. Ashford stopped in front of him. Status? 12 hostiles neutralized Sector 7. No friendly casualties beyond the initial breach. Security forces at the main gate have 3 KIA from the opening engagement. Parrish paused. The neutralizations were accomplished by a single shooter operating independently from the roof of Building 31. 14 rounds of .338 Lapua expended. The weapon issued was a Macmillan TAC 338 serial PS-007. Another pause. The inventory record for that weapon. I know what the inventory record says, Ashford said. Parrish looked at him. Where is she? Ashford said. Changing, Parrish said after a moment. She said 20 minutes. She was in Parrish's office in exactly 20 minutes. Dry, accused hair pulled back in a regulation bun that was still slightly damp at the nape. On her chest, the Medal of Honor ribbon and 8 other decorations that most of the people in the building could not have identified by sight. She had not worn them that morning. She wore them now because the conversation required a specific clarity about who held what ground, and the ribbons were part of that clarity. She sat down across from Parrish without waiting for an invitation. Parrish was behind his desk. Briggs was at the wall to the left, his notebook in his breast pocket. Captain Hayes from Internal Affairs was near the door. Luther Crane stood in the corner with his arms at his sides and his eyes on Sloan with the expression of a man who has resolved a question that had been open for 3 years and is not entirely sure how to feel about the resolution. Ashford took the chair beside the door and said nothing. His presence in the room was the presence of a senior officer observing a process he has authorized but is not directing. This was deliberate, and Sloan noted it. Parrish opened the file in front of him. Captain Morrison, he said. He used the name carefully the way you use a name when you are not certain the person sitting across from you will acknowledge it. Or Shadow 9 or Sloan Voss. Help me decide which one we're using. Sloan Voss is on my enlistment paperwork, sir. Don't. His voice was even. I have enough of your file to know what I'm looking at. 127 confirmed kills across 3 operational years. Kandahar, October 2019. A convoy that was hit with apparent prior knowledge of its route and a flag that was folded and handed to a man who I now understand to be the general, sitting in the corner of my office. He set down the file. What I don't have is why you're here. She put the thumb drive on his desk. No markings. Standard device. Captain Frank Hollis, she said. Start with his financial records. cryptocurrency transactions totaling approximately $50,000 over the past 8 months. Cross-reference the deposit dates against the casualty list for this installation's sniper program graduates over the same period. Parrish looked at the drive. Every time a graduate of this school deployed with a specific operational assignment, that assignment became known to hostile forces within 72 hours. She continued, good operators don't walk into ambushes at those rates. The pattern pointed toward this installation's program. Hollis was the node I needed to confirm. The only way to confirm him, Parrish said slowly, was to give him something to react to. A candidate with an inexplicable skill set and an apparently false background. Someone he would need to assess, neutralize, or escalate against. I needed him to move. And tonight, he moved. He contacted the hostile network and told them the timing window was optimal. He had inside information on patrol routes and the security response protocols because he had been inside this installation for 7 years. She met Parrish's eyes. The attack tonight was not a coincidence. It was a service he arranged and paid for. The thumb drive has the communication records. Parrish sat back. Hayes from near the door. How long have you been building this? 2 years, since we started losing operators at rates that exceeded statistical probability. Her voice did not change. The network I'm tracing has 17 confirmed nodes across multiple installations and agencies. Hollis was one of them. He was not the most important one, but he was the one I could reach. Parrish looked at Ashford. Ashford said nothing, which was an answer. Pull Hollis's quarters, Parrish said to Hayes. Everything, tonight. Hayes went. The room settled into the specific quiet that follows a large piece of information being set down in it. Briggs had not moved from his position at the wall. He was looking at Sloan with the expression of someone who has been documenting a situation for 12 hours and has just received confirmation that what he was documenting was far larger than his framework for it. He said the ammunition separation at the 100-yard line this morning and the brake lines. Yes, she said. I was going to say, he stopped, started again. I put it in the notebook. Everything. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but I knew it didn't fit. I know. Your documentation will be useful to the review board. He nodded. Something in his face settled the expression of a man who has been carrying an observation without a context and has finally been given one. Hayes came back in 11 minutes. His face said what his mouth was about to say. He set a photograph on the desk in front of Parrish. A young man in uniform smiling at the camera. The photograph had the soft edges of something handled many times over many years, taken out and looked at in the specific way that people look at the faces of those they have lost. On the back, in handwriting that belonged to a different Frank Hollis than the one who wrote operational reports, Fort Campbell, 2017. Parrish looked at it. He looked at Hayes. Hayes gave him the rest with his eyes. His son, Hayes said, Andrew Hollis, killed in action September 2017. His patrol walked into a prepared ambush outside Kandahar. He stopped. The subsequent investigation found evidence of prior intelligence compromise. The patrol route had been sold. The room took this in, not by Frank Hollis. The original compromise had come from somewhere else in the network, from one of the other nodes that Sloan had spent 2 years mapping. Andrew Hollis had died because information was sold. His father had stood at the graveside of a 24-year-old man who had trusted the institution they both served, and sometime after that graveside, Frank Hollis had made a calculation that the institution could not be trusted, and that if it could not be trusted, it deserved what was coming to it. He had become the thing that had killed his son. He had done it with full knowledge of what he was choosing, whether that was grief or conviction, or the particular madness of a man who needs his loss to mean something, who needs the universe to be organized around cause and effect, rather than the random cruelty of a system that sells its own people. The outcome was the same. 8 operators dead, 8 families. 8 casualty reports that attributed the deaths to hostile action, which was technically true and practically fraudulent. Nobody spoke for a long time. Twist 6 lay on Parrish's desk in the form of a photograph of a young man smiling, and it was the heaviest thing in the room. Sloan looked at the photograph for exactly as long as it took to understand it completely. Then she looked away. The network's remaining structure is on the drive, she said. 16 nodes beyond Hollis, all documented. Parrish picked up the thumb drive. He turned it in his hands. The hostiles tonight, they came here because Hollis told them to, because you were here. He identified me as a potential threat to his operation. He arranged the attack as a method of dealing with the threat under cover of an engagement that would be attributed to external actors. She paused. He was correct that I was a threat to his operation. He was incorrect about the method. You used his plan against him. I needed him to execute. If he had suspected the trap and delayed, he would have had time to move assets and warn the other nodes. He needed to believe he was winning. She looked at her hands for a moment. The death squad helped. Their behavior was exactly what he expected from them, which made the situation look exactly like what he thought it was. Ashford said from his corner, "Your assessment of the squad." The shift in the room was subtle but complete, from the language of investigation to the language of evaluation. The same woman but a different register. "Thorne has genuine leadership capacity," she said. "It's been expressed exclusively through dominance and intimidation, which is a coaching failure and a cultural failure, not a permanent characteristic. Reduce him in rank. 6 months under Crane's direct supervision with mandatory leadership coursework. Redirect the aggression towards something it can actually build. What he chooses to do with that opportunity is his." Parrish was writing, "Gifford and Kessler are followers. They will conform to the culture they are placed in, which means they can be functional in a healthy environment and destructive in a toxic one. I don't recommend investing further resources in determining which outcome they will produce here. Separate them from service. They're not bad people. They made bad choices when the social architecture around them made bad choices easy. Recommend civilian contractor work where the stakes of that dynamic are lower. Mercer has an impulse control problem that is not addressable through leadership training alone. Discharge with a genuine referral for treatment. That's a diagnostic recommendation, not a punitive one." She stopped at Ware. "Preston Ware," she said. "He identified that something was wrong when the pressure to accept it as normal was sustained and significant. He acted on that identification at personal cost to himself, and he did it twice, once when he warned me, and once when he detained Hollis in the parking lot on nothing but instinct and the instruction I gave him 6 hours earlier." She looked at Parrish directly. "That is the rarest quality in a soldier, not skill, not courage in the conventional sense. The ability to think independently when the group is moving in the wrong direction. Promote him, fast-track Ranger selection." "And Callahan," she added. "Nora Callahan, the strongest technical shooter in the program since day 2. Her scores have been recorded inaccurately by Hollis across the entire qualification period. Her actual performance is documented in Briggs's notebook, which is more accurate than the official record. She should be evaluated on the genuine numbers. Recommend continuation and advancement." Parrish looked up from his notes. "You're recommending retention for men who locked you in a bunker, which kept them in a fixed location away from the engagement. Untrained assistance during a combat action is a casualty profile. The bunker gave me operational freedom." She held his gaze. "The consequences they receive should be calibrated to what they did and what they're capable of becoming, not to what I feel about what they did." Parrish set down his pen. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man trying to reconcile several things that do not reconcile easily. A small woman in a large uniform, a row of commendations that most people in this building could not identify. 14 rounds expended in 13 minutes and 47 seconds, each one a confirmed neutralization. "What happens now?" he said. "To you." Ashford said from the corner, "Rachel." It was the only time anyone used that name in this room, and it landed with the weight of everything that was behind it. He said it in the tone of a man raising a subject he knows has already been decided and is raising anyway because some things need to be said, even when the saying changes nothing. "The Denver operations is the next phase," she said. "Hollis's financial records connect to procurement anomalies at a defense contractor with offices there. 2 of the remaining network nodes are embedded in that structure. Someone needs to be inside the process." "Your cover is burned," he said. "Sloan Voss's cover is burned. Rebecca Marsh starts a financial analyst position in Denver on Monday." She turned to look at him directly. "The legend is built. The access is arranged." He looked at her for a long time. The look of a man who has had this conversation before in different rooms with different names attached to the identities on either side of it, and who knows how it ends and who says what he is going to say anyway. "I won't pull you," he said. "You know I won't. But I want you to hear me say this." "I hear you." "How many years, Rachel? How many identities before, until it's finished?" Her voice did not rise and did not soften. "Until the network is gone. Until our people stop dying because someone sold their names." She met his eyes. "How many names did you count at the Kandahar Memorial when they folded the flags?" He didn't answer. "I count 7, she said. "Every night, whatever name I'm sleeping under. 7 names every night until it's done." The room was quiet. Hayes and Briggs and Crane were all looking at the floor or the wall with the careful attention that people pay to objects that are not the thing they are actually attending to. Parrish cleared his throat. "Captain Morrison, regarding the official record of tonight's engagement. Specialist Sloan Voss fails her psychological evaluation," she said. unstable, possibly delusional, discharged with mental health recommendations, and a referral that goes nowhere because the person it's referring doesn't exist. She stood and picked up her cover from the edge of the desk. The Sector 7 neutralizations are credited to the Quick Reaction Force. The 14 rounds appear in the expenditure log as a clerical error that gets corrected and then lost in the correction. And the weapon, returned to inventory under the same authorization that pulled it. It stays there. A brief pause. For the same reason it was kept there in the first place. She moved toward the door. Parrish stood an instinct of courtesy that surprised him slightly. He extended his hand across the desk. After a moment, she took it. Her grip was firm, calloused, real in the way that things earned through use are real. "Whoever you are," he said, "thank you." Something moved briefly in her eyes. Not gratitude and not warmth exactly, but something that acknowledged the statement without deflecting it. "Just doing my job, sir," she said. She walked out. Ashford was the last to leave. He stopped at the door and looked back at Parrish, who was sitting with the photograph of Andrew Hollis still on his desk and the expression of a man recalibrating. "The review board will want Briggs's notebook," Ashford said. "Make sure it's preserved." "It will be." Ashford nodded. He went. In the corridor, Sloan was already gone. Twist 7 happened in a room down the hall 40 minutes later with a military psychologist named Major Garrett, who had 14 years of clinical experience and a clearance that permitted him to evaluate operational personnel. He was thorough. He used standardized instruments and asked the questions those instruments required. He was good at his job. Sloan answered incorrectly, not randomly, with precision. She knew the clinical architecture of this evaluation in the way that she knew a great many things that were not in her file through a process of study and repetition, and the practical application of knowledge in conditions where the cost of not knowing was too high to consider. She knew exactly which response patterns would produce a profile of instability sufficient to justify administrative separation without triggering the mandatory intervention protocols that would delay her exit from the installation. Too much dysfunction and they would hold her. Too little and she would pass. The target was a narrow band and she hit it without difficulty. Major Garrett wrote his findings with genuine professional concern. He recommended discharge with mental health support referral. He noted in his private session log, which would never be reviewed by anyone with the context to understand what he was looking at, that the patient had demonstrated a level of composure during the evaluation that seemed inconsistent with the profile her responses described. He flagged this as a possible dissociative coping mechanism and moved on. Sloan Voss was processed out of Fort Bragg within 72 hours. Somewhere in a system requiring 3 separate authorizations, a file was updated, asset reactivated, Phase 3 complete, Phase 4 identity confirmed. Rebecca Marsh. The court-martial of Captain Frank Hollis was convened 3 weeks later in a room that did not appear in the building directory, and it proceeded in closed session, and his testimony consumed 4 days and named 14 additional compromised personnel across 6 installations. Each name represented a leak. Each leak represented operators who had deployed carrying information that was already in enemy hands. The arrests were quiet. There were no press releases, no public statements, no news cycle. Problems simply stopped existing in the way that they had previously existed. Families of the 8 dead operators received no additional information beyond what they had already been told, because there was no explanation available that would have made the loss more bearable, and several that would have made it worse. These things are the nature of the work that is done in the dark for the sake of the people in the light, and the people in the dark do not generally receive the acknowledgement that their work represents. They know this when they choose the work. Most of them make their peace with it, some of them don't. Sloan Voss had made her peace with it 7 names ago. Owen Briggs submitted his 43-page notebook to the review board and received a letter of commendation that cited exceptional observational acuity and professional judgment. He framed neither. He put the commendation in a folder and the letter in a drawer and kept the notebook itself because the notebook was his and because what it contained was a record of something he had watched happen in real time without fully understanding it, and he was still not certain he fully understood it even now. He went back to work. He stood on the qualification range and watched the next class arrive, and he wrote in a new notebook. But sometimes at the end of a qualification day, he walked out to the 500-yard line and stood where he had stood when he walked down to check the target, and he thought about 7 rounds through 1 hole and about what it costs to hide what you are so completely that the hiding itself becomes the evidence. He thought about the kind of person who could do that and still function, still fire a rifle in the rain on a rooftop, still walk back through the dark and return the weapon to inventory, and say the round count in the flat, even voice of someone completing a task. He never discussed it with anyone. Some observations are their own complete thing, requiring nothing further. Nora Callahan's scores were re-examined against Briggs's documented observations. Her actual performance across the qualification period placed her in the top 3 candidates overall. She was advanced to the subsequent sniper course. She broke 3 program records in the first 4 weeks. Sometimes on a difficult shot in a bad crosswind, she had the feeling that someone was watching. Not in a threatening way, in the way that you feel watched by someone who cares about the outcome. She had spent enough time around a certain kind of person in the preceding weeks to understand that this feeling might have a literal explanation, and she found the possibility more useful than unsettling. It made her shoot better. She did not investigate the feeling. She just shot better. Garrett Thorne served 6 months as a private under Luther Crane's direct supervision, and those 6 months were the hardest thing he had done in his adult life, which was the point. Difficulty in the service of ambition is one thing. Difficulty that does not serve your ego and does not advance your position and does not produce anything you can put on a record, that difficulty is a different kind of test entirely. And it tests the part of a person that all the other tests do not reach. Crane supervised him with the patience of a man who has watched this decision made many times, the decision about who you are going to be when the decision costs you something. He did not make the decision for Thorne. He watched. At the end of the 6 months, Crane wrote a 3-sentence evaluation. The 3rd sentence read, "He is beginning to understand the difference between strength and performance." That was enough. Preston Ware graduated Ranger School 11 months after that night with an assessment noting in the specific dry language of official evaluation, exceptional independent decision-making under peer pressure conditions and strong tactical instinct in ambiguous situations. His primary instructor recommended him for special operations selection without qualification or reservation. He kept 2 things in his left chest pocket: a photograph of a young man in dress uniform grinning at whoever held the camera, and a small folded piece of paper, 9 words in precise block print. No signature. You already know what right looks like. Trust it. He carried both for a long time. Douglas Parrish retired 14 months after that night. On his desk in the small consulting office where he spent his post-service years advising on institutional culture and leadership development, he kept a photograph. A small woman in an oversized uniform covered in mud, surrounded by much larger men, who are looking at her with the contempt that people express when they have decided in advance that they know what they're looking at. Visitors assumed it was a cautionary artifact from a campaign against hazing and bullying in military training programs. He did not correct them. He sometimes told the young officers who came through his office that every hunter eventually becomes the hunted, and the question is whether you know which role you're currently playing. They usually thought he was speaking metaphorically. He was not speaking metaphorically. At Fort Bragg, the ammunition inventory continued to show a recurring anomaly. Quarterly reconciliation, same storage location, same caliber. Exactly 14 rounds of .338 Lapua Magnum gone against an asset code that the armorer had been told to log without inquiry. The armorer logged it. He had been logging it for 2 years without meeting the person who drew the rounds. The authorization was clean. The code was valid. The questions that the situation suggested were questions that had been closed at a level above his access. He did his job. He kept his records. He understood through a process of careful professional inference that some answers exist at a level of classification that renders the question itself classified. 14 rounds every quarter, never more, never less. Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60 on a Thursday in March. The weather had not decided whether it was still winter. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind moved through the rows of white stones with the quality that wind has in cemeteries, carrying something that is not quite sound and is not quite silence, but is its own particular register. General Theodore Ashford stood in front of a headstone. The regulation inscription gave a name, 2 dates, and a designation. Below the designation, in letters that were not standard on military grave markers, but had been placed there through a process that left no official trace, beloved warrior, fresh flowers, lilies. Someone had placed them within the past 24 hours. They had not come from him. He stood with his hands at his sides and did not think about the briefing at 1600 hours or the situation developing in 2 separate theaters that would require decisions before end of week. He stood and let himself be for a few minutes, simply a man in front of a stone that bore his wife's name. A voice from behind and to his right, someone should keep up appearances. He did not turn around. He had learned over a long time that turning too quickly interrupted the transition she needed to make between what she was presenting and what was actually there. She came up beside him. In his peripheral vision, short hair somewhere between auburn and red, not her natural color. Plain frame glasses. The suit of someone who works with financial records in an office building, someone easily overlooked in a crowd, because nothing about her draws the eye, nothing signals anything other than ordinariness. 100,000 people in this country look exactly like the person she was presenting. She looked nothing at all like the person he had married in a ceremony with 4 witnesses and no photographer, and a legal record that was itself classified in a room where nobody was introduced by their real name. She stood beside him and looked at the headstone. How long, he said. 6 months minimum. The procurement structure is more layered than the initial analysis suggested. 2 nodes embedded in finance, 1 in acquisition review. Rebecca Marsh needs to establish herself before she can reach them. And after Denver, the network still has infrastructure in 2 other agencies. After Denver, we'll know which one needs to move first. He was quiet for a time. The wind moved through the rows of stones. You could stop, he said. After this one, the program has trained people specifically for this kind of work. They're ready. They're good, she said. They're not ready for what comes after Denver. You don't know that. I know what comes after Denver. They don't yet. Rachel. He said it with the particular weight of a name that has not been used in a long time and carries in the saying of it everything that the names that have come since cannot carry. She looked at him. The glasses changed the geometry of her face slightly, which was one of their functions. Her attention did not change. That quality, the flat, precise focus of someone who has learned to see accurately, because inaccuracy costs too much, that had never changed across all the names and all the faces in all the rooms where she had sat across from people who were trying to understand a situation that was larger than what they were being shown. How many names did you count, she said, at the Kandahar Memorial? He did not answer. The wind moved. 7, she said. I count 7 every night, whatever bed I'm sleeping in, whatever name is on the ID in my wallet. 7 names and I'm not done yet. He turned and looked at her directly, the way he had been waiting to look at her since the helicopter landed at Fort Bragg. The face she was wearing was not the face he had memorized, but the eyes behind the plain frame glasses were the eyes he had stood next to in a room with 4 witnesses, and they were looking back at him. Be careful, he said. He said it knowing it was insufficient and saying it anyway because the insufficient thing was what there was. I'm always careful. No, his voice was quiet. You're always effective. That's not the same thing. She looked at him. The wind moved through the lilies on the stone. Then she reached over and put her hand over his. 3 seconds, not more. Long enough to be real, brief enough to be hers, the gesture of a woman who has learned to give exactly as much as she decides to give and no more, and who has decided in this moment to give that much. I'll try to remember that, she said. She walked away through the rows of white stones, her footsteps making no sound on the path, her posture ordinary in the way that very good work is invisible. A woman in a suit going somewhere that had nothing to do with this cemetery. He watched her until she turned between 2 rows of stones and was gone. He stood in front of the headstone for another few minutes. The lilies moved slightly. He put on his cover and walked back toward the car, and the wind moved through section 60 with the quality that wind has in that place, which is its own kind of sound. In a hotel room in Denver, a woman with short auburn hair and plain-framed glasses sat at a desk with 2 monitors and a portable drive and financial records from a defense contractor that employed at last count approximately 4,200 people in 7 states. The anomalies were subtle. They were the kind of thing that a casual review would not find, and a motivated review would take weeks to trace, and a person who knew what she was looking for and why could locate in about 4 hours. She had been working for 3 hours and 14 minutes. Her phone, a standard model. Nothing that would draw attention, buzzed. A message from a blocked number, 3 words, phase 7 confirmed. She deleted the message. She returned to the spreadsheets. Rebecca Marsh was good at her job. She was thorough and quiet, and the people around her who would later describe her as pleasant and a little forgettable would not be able to say exactly when she had arrived or exactly how she had come to have access to the records she had access to, because these things had happened gradually in the way that trust accretes in institutions through presence, through competence, through the slow accumulation of ordinary days. In her luggage in this closet, wrapped in clothing and packed in a case that could have held anything, 14 rounds of .338 Lapua Magnum lay in their individual recesses, just in case, because sometimes a qualification range becomes a battlefield, because sometimes the person who was supposed to be the lesson turns out to be the instructor, because sometimes the dead don't stay buried. They just reload and go back to work and count 7 names in the dark before they sleep and wake up in the morning under a name that isn't theirs and do it again, because someone has to walk in the dark to keep the light safe. And she wasn't done yet. The thing about Fort Bragg Sniper School in the years after was not that it produced better shooters. It had always produced good shooters. The 2% who passed had always been good. What changed incrementally and without announcement was the kind of person the 2% tended to be, the degree to which technical excellence coincided with the quality that Sloan Voss had identified in Preston Ware as rarest and most necessary, the ability to think independently when the group around you has stopped thinking clearly. This is harder to train than marksmanship. You cannot put it on a qualification form or measure it at a range. You can only put people in situations where it is required and watch what they do and then make decisions about what you have seen. Parrish's successor understood this. He had read Briggs's 43-page notebook. He had read the internal review that Ashford's people had produced from the events of that night. He had read between the lines with the practiced attention of a senior officer who knows that what institutional reports leave out is often more instructive than what they include. And he had built his approach around the understanding that the most dangerous vulnerability in any institution is not the enemy outside, but the rot inside, and that the most effective defense against that rot is not tighter control, but better people. He never met Sloan Voss. He never learned her real name. He read about her in a partially redacted file that his security officer had spent 2 weeks getting cleared, and what he read told him enough. He kept the one page of the file that was not redacted in the top drawer of his desk, and when he was making a decision about a candidate or a program adjustment or a cultural question that did not have an obvious answer, he sometimes pulled it out and looked at it. The page contained no photographs and no identifying information. It contained only a number 127 confirmed in a single assessment notation in the margin, handwritten by someone whose signature had been removed. She counted the names of the dead before she went to work. Every time, he kept the page because it answered a question he needed answered regularly. What does excellence in this work actually require, not just from the hands, from the whole person? The answer was in that notation. You have to carry the weight of what you are doing and still be able to do it precisely. That is the standard. Everything else is preparation for whether you can meet it. Garrett Thorne, in his second year after the reduction, took a candidate aside during a morning run, a small man from New Mexico who had been struggling with the weight standards and had started showing up earlier and earlier each morning to run extra miles before the official day began. Thorne ran with him for a while without speaking. Then he said in a voice that was different from any voice that Gifford or Kessler or Mercer had ever heard come out of him, "The point isn't the time on the clock. The point is whether you're still getting up when it would be easier to stop." The candidate looked at him. "That's the test," Thorne said. "Everything else is how the test is administered." He ran on ahead and did not look back, and the candidate stood for a moment in the gray morning light and then ran after him, and neither of them spoke about it again. But the candidate remembered it later in a situation where remembering it was the difference between making a good decision and making an easy one, and he made the good decision and it mattered. Luther Crane heard this story secondhand from an instructor who had been close enough to hear it. He wrote it in a small journal he kept separate from his professional documentation in the section he reserved for things that suggested the future might be different from the past. He wrote Thorne. Maybe he had learned in 31 years that maybe was enough to start with. In Denver, Rebecca Marsh worked her third week. She had identified the first clean thread in the procurement anomaly, a payment routed through a subsidiary that existed on paper in 3 states and in reality in none of them. She pulled the thread carefully, the way you pull a thread when you know the fabric is larger than what you can see and you need to understand its shape before you begin unraveling it. The window of her rented apartment looked east. In the morning, the light came in at an angle that reminded her of nothing in particular, which was the way she preferred the morning she woke up under someone else's name. No associations, just the light and the work and the 7 names she counted before she got up, the same as every morning, the same as every name. She made coffee. She opened the laptop. She went back to work.